The initial intent of creation was that God's presence should be on the terrestrial level, not in heaven with the angels. When did that happen? At the time of the Mishkan. The Mishkan was called the communion tent. In that tent, you had the Holy and the Holy of Holies. You had the Ark, what we called the Aron. In the Ark, you had the first set of tablets that were broken. It's referred to as Shivrei Luchos, the broken tablets. You had the second set of tablets, and you had a Sefer Torah. It was covered with a slab of gold, and on top of that slab, part of that slab, you had two cherubs. That was the location of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence. So where was the divine presence in this existence? Exactly in that communion tent. How big was this? Relatively speaking, very small location. If you would compare that location to the vastness of a desert, it wouldn't even be noticed. Why? Because in terms of the area it occupies, it's almost infinitesimal compared to the vastness of a desert. But in terms of its innateness, what it represents and what it is, all existence is not what that is. Because what that is, that's the location where the divine presence dwells, and the source of all existence is the divine presence. So although in terms of its physical location, it may seem to be insignificant, but because of that location representing and meeting all the criteria to be the location to accommodate the divine presence, that location's everything. And everything emanates from that location, because that's God's presence is there. The Mishkan was temporary. What was the ultimate location? The Beis Hamikdash, the temple in Yerushalayim, where it was built, Jerusalem. That was considered, it finally came to the Menucha. It came to its resting location. Until that moment, it was a number of places, whether it's the Mishkan, as they traveled, it would be constructed, dismantled, back and forth, but that was the divine presence. They came into Israel, we had a Mishkan, then we had a Mishkan Shiloh. The Mishkan of Shiloh was a semi-permanent structure. And finally, after Mishkan Shiloh, we came to Yerushalayim. The temple was built by Shlomo Melech, King Solomon. That was Bonu El HaMenucha. We came to the Menucha. Fine, that was the resting place. But even the Temple Mount, compared to existence, it's considered, they used to say that before the 6-Day War, the size of the state of Israel was smaller than the state of New Jersey. They compared it to Rhode Island. That's how big all Israel was. But you realize, but Israel is called the Holy Land. Why is it called the Holy Land? Because that location has relevance to God. The rest of the world doesn't have that same relevance to God. It may be a narrow strip of land, but that narrow strip of land, in God's eyes, has more value than all existence because of what it is, the way God values it. Even more so, the Temple Mount, where the divine presence is there. The Jewish people, in number, were the smallest people in the world. That's in the physicality of the Jewish people. What about the innate worth and value of the Jewish people? It's not quantifiable. Why? For the same reason. Just as the location of the Holy of Holies, that location in terms of its innate value was unquantifiable. because of God's association with that location. Identically, the Jew, because at Sinai we were taken as God's chosen people, and we have this inextricable relationship. We cannot be separated. We were designated as Goy Kadosh, the holy people. Therefore, out the innateness of the Jew, even one Jew is more than all existence, than all the nations of the world, because they're not connected at that level to the source of everything. We're connected to the infinite. They're not connected. They're beneficiaries of the infinite, but they're not connected to the infinite. We're called holy because of that level of connection. We're going to begin. Hashem speaks to Moshe. The first verse says, "B'midbar Sinai," in the Sinai desert. How big is the Sinai desert? Vast location. Where in the Sinai desert did he speak to? Did he speak to Moshe? B'Oel Moed, in the communal tent, the communion tent. So in terms of the order, the way the Torah is presenting the facts, we're speaking about the vastness of the desert, and specifically in that desert, it was the communion tent. So I'm going from the broader to the more specific. Okay? In terms of location. Usually the Torah has a certain symmetry. I'm going from the broader to the more specific. On the calendar, what was the date? Be'echad lachodesh hasheni. It was the first of the second month. So I'm speaking of the day, the month, Rishon Hashenis. In the second year, let's say some Yisrael Mitzrayim, second year that we've been out of Egypt. So how am I going from? I'm starting with the most specific, the day, the month, and then the year. It seems to be, it's not the same symmetry. We started with vast, the Sinai desert. Where in the Sinai desert? Oel Moed. Then when we speak of time, the first day of the second month in the second year. Seems to be, it's not consistent. So Rav Chaim HaKadosh explains exactly what we said. No, it's very consistent. We're going from the lesser to the greater. Midbar Sinai compared to the communion tent is going from infinitesimal to infinite. Because what's Midbar Sinai? Let's say it's 1,000 miles of desert. The communion tent is a location 4x4, an area. But what was its innateness? That's God's presence. So I'm going from the lesser to the greater. And we continue to go from the lesser to the greater. The first of the second month in the second year. Because when I talk about time, the first of the month is less than the month. And the month is less than the year. So the order, it's a consistent order. The lesser to the greater. In the Agora, we say, Baruch HaMokom Baruch Hu. Blessed is the Mokom, blessed is he. Baruch Shenosan Torah Lamo Yisrael. Blessed is he who gave the Torah to his people Israel. So we said this many times. Why is God called Mokom? God is called the location. What is the basis for existence? The basis for existence is because God wills its existence. If he would cease willing it for a moment, what would be? There's no existence. So regarding existence, what is God's value to existence? He's the Mokom. He's the basis for its existence. As the location is the basis for anything that exists within that existence, God is the basis for all existence. So he's the ultimate location. He's the ultimate Mokom. Therefore, Baruch HaMokom, blessed is the Mokom, God himself, Asher Nosan Torah Yisrael, that he gave the Torah to the Jewish people. And he only created that location for the sake of the Jewish people to be challenged within the context of Torah. That's the understanding. What did he tell Moshe? Suas rosh kavadas b'nei Yisrael mishpachos b'savosam. Count the heads of all the congregation of Israel, according to the families, the paternal families. How many members are in each family and in each tribe? We know that just as a Kohen is only a Kohen if his father's a Kohen, if his mother's a daughter of a Kohen, means nothing in terms of pedigree, to identify the person, his pedigree. If your father's a Levi, you're a Levi, because that's the paternal. And if your father's a Yisrael, an Israelite, ordinary Yisrael, you're an Yisrael. So that's the base of Osam. The counting has to be, we want to know how many members are there in every family identified with a tribe. That's the value, the purpose of this counting. And who's being counted? The males. The males, according to the head count. At what age do you count them? When do we take the census, so to say? From the age of 20 and above, Kol Yotzei Tzava b'Yisrael. Only those who are eligible and qualified for conscription in the army. Only they should be counted according to their numbers. So the commentators all explained, if not for the sin of the Meraglim, the spies, we were meant to go in right away. And although the conquest of Israel was miraculous, you read the story of how they conquered Jericho. Every day they would encircle Jericho. They would blow the shofar. And they repeated this for 6 days. On the seventh day, they encircled it 7 times. They blew the shofar each time, and then finally, at the end, the walls of Jericho sunk into the ground. They entered, and they destroyed the city. It took possession of the city. There wasn't one casualty. It was miraculous. So what do we need? A standing army. If the conquest of Israel, initially, Canaan was miraculous, what do we need? A standing army? So Nachmanides explains, Ramban explains, we have a principle in life, it's called Ein Somchen al Hanes. We don't rely on miracles. The human being has to take the initiative to his best ability. And if, in fact, the initiative is not sufficient, then God comes into the picture. And even if it's not, we go to battle and we win the battle. What do we win the battle? You could be prepared and sophisticated, but you still can lose the battle. You only win the battle if God wants you to win the battle. But if you don't even have a standing army, you understand? That's a revealed miracle. First, we have to do what we have to do. We have a standing army. That we don't waste a bullet. That just tells you. And no casualties, that God's behind every soldier. And God is bringing this about. So right now, we're speaking about count the Jews because we have to know the numbers of able-bodied men who are ready for battle, age of 20 and above. Will they be needed? Separate discussion. But we have to do what we have to do. The whole concept of initiative is only if it's within the realm of rational behavior. A person has to escape to wherever it may be. and you have no means of, you've overturned every stone and you have no means of escape. But if you have a plane, you'd be able to be taken out easily. But there's no air transport. What do? You pray to God that somehow he should take you out of here. What about a person goes and he gets himself a ladder and he stands on top of the ladder and he starts waving that some eagle should come and take him off the top of the ladder and take him somewhere else? You understand? That's not called initiative. That's called foolishness. At that point, God's telling you, it's up to me. If I want you to live, you're going to live. And if it's not meant to live, I will not intervene. But until that point where you could and you don't, if you don't, then you're making a mistake. Then you're actually acting irresponsible. That's the concept of initiative, what we call hishtadlus. So right now that we have to count per family, per tribe, and as they would travel, the formation, this is all for this purpose. And that's why it says 20 where you're eligible for conscription. The Torah makes it a point. The Torah speaks about the pedigree of these people. When they were counted, who counted them? Moshe, Aaron, and the princes of each tribe. They were there to count them. So you can say the princes of the tribe because they had to identify them. What about Moshe and Aaron? They didn't know who they were. So the Ramban writes, because Moshe's eye and Aaron's eye was so positive, when they would lay their eye on every individual who's been counted, he received the blessing from Moshe and Aaron. They were blessed. Like a person goes to a holy rabbi for a blessing. He looks at him and he says something. Every Jew was blessed. That's why they were integral in the counting. Because if the princes themselves recognize them, count them, what do you need Moshe and Aaron there? The answer is because they're integral, because that you have that special ability is only because these two special holy people set their eye on you. Them even setting their eye on you gives you that special level of what? Of worthiness for divine intervention for that reason. Okay? But they had to prove their pedigree. How do they prove their pedigree? So the Torah tells us they gathered, assembled a complete congregation at the first of the second month, and the Torah uses an interesting term. What does it mean, Vayisialdu? They came with documents of pedigree to prove that they were legitimate, that they were the children of the parents. They were always recognized that they were part of this family. Meaning they were not of incestuous, of illicit unions. They were not from adultery, not from incest. They were all purebreds. And every Jew brought his document to identify he's from this family. And he was raised by that family because he was from that family. Why was that important? If they say, I'm from this family, what do you have to bring that greater level of proof to verify his pedigree, that he's not illegitimate? So one of the commentators cites a Gemara that says the Shekhinah only dwells only on Jews who are michosin, which they can prove their purity. If they're purebreds, God has relevance to that. If they're illegitimate, what we call mamzer, you came about due to a forbidden relationship, God will not, his presence will not dwell in that context. If you're going to battle, it's crucial, and it says in David HaMelech's army, before you were eligible to be conscripted, you had to prove your pedigree. If you couldn't, you weren't taken into the army. Of course, the success and victory was dependent, is God with you or not with you? That's what it's all about. The divine presence only dwells if you have pedigree, if you have yichus, if you have that purity. We read in Vayikra, we spoke about the incestuous relationships and the adulterous relationships. Either carries spiritual excision, carries the death penalty, different levels of death penalty. And then it says, God says, I don't want you to behave this way, the way the Egyptians behaved and the way the Canaanim behaved. Because the Canaanites, because they behaved this way, Vatoki or it's osam. The land spit them out. The land regurgitated them. The land could not tolerate this level of impurity, therefore they were cast out of the land. And if you behave this way, you'll be cast out of the land. This behavior, there's a word in Hebrew, it's called to'eva. To'eva is an abomination. This behavior is called abominable behavior. God says, I will not associate with myself with anything which has this level of impurity. This abominable behavior, I will not have anything to do with it. So if the land of Israel is God's location, it's location of the Shekhinah, because these people, they behaved in a context of abominable behavior, God says, you people are out of here. I will not tolerate it. The land spit them out. So what is illegitimacy? It's a product of To'eva. It's the issue of abomination. Incest is an abomination. Adultery is an abomination. That's what it is. So if you're the child of that, God says, I can't have a relationship. Therefore, when they came to be counted, for the sake that the Shekhinah dwells in our midst, which is the camp of the Jewish people, they had to bring their documents of pedigree to show and prove the purity of pedigree. The Gemara tells us, without too far from Shuas, we commemorate the giving of Torah at Sinai. It's called Zaman Matan Torah Seinu, which we're going to say in 2 weeks. It's the day of the time of the giving of our Torah. So according to the Gemara, before God offered the Torah to the Jewish people, he offered it to the nations of the world. And he went to every nation. Do you want it? So the first question they asked is, they asked God, what is it all about? And he shared what it was about. They said, it doesn't fit our lifestyle. It's not our cup of tea. We prefer to pass on it. And they passed. Hashem offers it to the Jewish people. They don't ask, what is it all about? They just say, Nasiv and Nishma. We accept unequivocally. If you're offering it, we embrace it immediately. What's the extent of the obligation? Whatever it is, we're accepting it. So not only did the Jews not reject it, they didn't even ask, what is it all about? If it's your will, we're here to do your will. And we embraced it. Nasiv and Nishma. But according to our Gemara, it was first offered to the nations of the world, and then it was offered to us, to the Jewish people. As a result, we became the chosen people. According to the Midrash says differently. And it has to do with this week's reading. It wasn't offered to the nations of the world at all. And it was offered to us, and we accepted it. After we accepted it, nations of the world come to God and say, what's going on? Are you playing favorites? Why don't you offer it to us? So he said to them, I want to ask you a question. Is there any way that you could prove your purity of pedigree? They said no. Why? Is it a problem? Of course it's a problem. All you people are products of incest and adultery. My children, they have documents of pedigree to prove the purity of pedigree. That's what they said. When they heard this, they were amazed. There's a verse in Mishle, in Proverbs, which we say Friday night, Eshes Chayu, Komu vonel ve'yashruah. When they heard this, the children stood up and they extolled the Jewish people. They said, whoever heard of such a thing? A person, the sexual drive is the most all-consuming drive. And they were able to restrain it and suppress it, God forbid, not to cross lines. They were amazed. They said, now we understand why you gave it to them and we weren't eligible to receive the Torah. Because since that behavior is considered abominable behavior and the illegitimate child is the product of that, God says, I have no association with that. To become a God's people, you have to reflect purity. And if you're a product of incest or adultery, that's an abomination. God has nothing to do with abomination. And they appreciated it. The children stood up and they extolled it. They extolled us. What happens? Fast forward a little bit. The 40th year in the desert. Bilam attempted to curse the Jews and destroy us. It didn't work. So he went and gave advice to Balak, who was the king of Moab. The way you're going to snare the Jews, you have to get them to get involved with the Moabite women, and they should have relations. They will come out and seduce them because Elokeim Shishel Sodi Zima. The God of the Jews will not tolerate licentiousness. He will not tolerate it. This is abomination. He will not. And if they fail, there's no Jewish people. They will be annihilated. What happens? Sure enough, it was working. Zimri, the prince of the tribe of Shimon, he cohabits publicly with Cosbi, the Midianite princess, and the Jews are involved. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, he sees this. He's the true zealot. He goes and he kills Zimri with this Midianite princess. The plague stops immediately. So God says, if Pinchas wouldn't have acted with his zealotry, I would have destroyed the Jewish people because of what was going on. Exactly as Bilam said it. The God of Israel will not tolerate licentiousness. This illicit sexual behavior will not tolerate it. Pinchas, his wrath, he says, he expressed my wrath through his zealotry, therefore I don't have to destroy it. But 40,000 Jews died in the plague as a result of what happened. Now, the nations of the world come to God and said, look, the only reason why he said the Jews are eligible for the Torah, and we're not, because they're pure, they don't behave sexually irresponsibly, and we do. The Jews are behaving just as we behaved. You know, maybe now there's room for us to get in. Because there's a common denominator between them and us. Until now, there was no common, but now there is. So maybe we're eligible now, or no less not eligible. God says, I won't tell you a secret. All those Jews who were involved with these Moabite women, every one of them died in a plague. 40,000 Jews died in the plague. So we weeded out all that impurity. Therefore, the Jews that remain, they're all pure. They did not cross those lines. As a result of that, they are my people eternally. The Torah is immutable. They are there forever. Inextricably separable. You can't separate them. That's what we are. But again, now there's something interesting. You know, there's an expression in English, where there's smoke, there's fire. But if there's no smoke, there's no reason to think there's fire. Over there's smoke, there's fire. Right after the 40,000 Jews died in the plague, God says, I want them to be counted. Why does he want us to be counted? Because the Midrash says, just as a shepherd, if a wolf comes into the flock and kills some of the sheep, because of the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep, he wants to know how many sheep are left. It's the expression of his love for his flock, his dedication to his flock. Identically, whenever there's a plague, God says, I want a recounting. Recount the Jews. I want to know how many are left. To show God's love for us, that although, of course, he knows the number, but overtly wanting to know the number. We go through the motions of counting again. We know exactly how many are no longer there. That's the value of the counting. It's a demonstration of love. But when we were counted after the plague, the 40,000 Jews died in that plague, because of the Moabite women, their unacceptable behavior, the Torah says God attests for the pedigree of every one of the families. These families were counted before. And the way they're referred to is this way. It speaks about the families of Yehuda, of Judah. HaChanochi, HaPalui, HaKarmi. The name of the family is Karmi, Keren, or Karmi, but they're referred to Har Karmi, HaChanochi, HaPalui. There's a Hey at the beginning of the word, and it ends with a Yud. We know that Yud Hey is one of the names of God. Because what did the nations of the world say? The nations of the world said when they were counting themselves, according to the pedigree, they said, who are you fooling? You were slaves in Egypt. If the Egyptian masters had control over your bodies and they could torture you and kill you, don't you think they defiled your women? So what are you priding yourselves? You have this pedigree. You're probably all of Egyptian descent. Because your masters, they defiled the women. You think you're Jewish, but you're not. Even though you're Jewish because of the mother, but in terms of who fathered the child, it was an Egyptian. God comes and says, I personally attest that every Jew that's been counted is the purebred. HaChanochi, the family of Chanoch, Yud K, attest pure. Karmi, I tested pure. Every one of them I tested pure. So I asked the question, until then, God did not have to attest to the purity of the Jewish people. We counted. This family had so many people, this tribe had so many people. There's no mention that God has to attest to that fact. And therefore the letters of Hey Yud are associated with each of the families. Why now, after the Baal Peor, after the story of the women, the Moabite women, does God have to attest to the purity? Why? The answer is very simple. Until the story of the Moabite woman with the Jews were always above reproach. There was never a question that the Jew is above this. Regardless, he may be a slave. He's above it. Being above it, we would never even consider it. It would never enter our minds that maybe they are children of illicit relations. Wouldn't even consider it. Therefore, they're counted. God doesn't have to attest. Because the Jewish people had so an aura of purity, there's no way. They are worthy of divine protection. No Egyptian will go near their wives. They may have been able to kill them, but this area to be violated, not possible. Once the Jews themselves failed in this area, because now we see that this Achilles heel even exists among the Jews. As I said, 40,000 Jews were involved here. That's a significant number, Maybe in Egypt, they didn't merit that divine protection. Maybe their wives were defiled. And therefore they believed they're Jews, but really they're Egyptians. On that God says, I attest personally that they are of legitimate issue. They're not illegitimate. And therefore they have relevance to have that relationship with me. There, it's mentioned only after they cross that line. Before they ever cross the line, there's never a consideration to consider it. But that's all part of divine. God would not allow that to enter in their minds, and even would, it would be dismissed immediately. So God didn't have to come personally attest to it. Now, after fact, where they did fail, now God says, now I have to attest to it, to your purity, which until now wasn't necessary. It's a known fact. The two zoos in the United States are the best zoos, the best zoology department. It's not Cornell. It's not. St. Louis, San Diego. Person goes, makes an offer to a person. They said, you ever see the lions and tigers, that area, the pavilion? Each animal has its own quarters, 100 yards. It's clean. The food is first quality. You have doctors to check you every day. Not even a vet. They'll check you, a doctor. But you will put you in this limited location for the rest of your life. And all those days there, you'll be provided with food, with all your medical care. And we'll pay for the burial when you pass away after so many years, when you die. And if your alternative is to live on the street, it's a better alternative. Person says, something. I prefer to live with a roof over my head and live like confined in a location where I'm raised like an animal and I'm taken care of like an animal. I'm a human being. I have to have areas, I have to have my freedoms. I have the context to lead my own life. I don't want to be there. So the Midrash says, the Jews failed continuously in the desert. We failed. So God says, based on the verse, Hamidbar Yishelochem, that I treat you like you were in the desert. When you went into the desert, you say a person says, I believed it was going to be, the accommodations would be such. Then you come, the plumbing's not working, the beds are not clean, there's no heat. They said, look, this is not what I counted on. The whole thing is a mistake from the very beginning, from get-go. God says, when you were in the desert, if a king goes into the desert, isn't there even a consideration that all the amenities that he has in the palace are going to be provided in the desert? It's not possible. God says, something, but I provided it. I provided the clouds of glory to protect you from the elements. I provided the manna to protect you, to sustain you without bodily functions. So it doesn't infringe on your life. I provided you with a wellspring that even though this desert where there's no water, guaranteed water. Plus, due to the clouds of glory, the clothing was always laundered. They never outgrew it. It never became frayed. And even as an adult, as it says that just as an animal, its hide grows on it, grows with it, as the children grew miraculously, the clothing always fit. Yeah. So infant, toddler, adolescent, adult. That's what it was. The same clothing, just grew and always was laundered. What provided that? The clouds of glory provided that. So we had the manna, we had the clouds of glory, and we had the wellspring. The mud was in the merit of Moshe. The wellspring was in the merit of Miriam. The clouds of glory were in the merit of Aaron. I've given you three very responsible caretakers, leaders, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. Their leadership is one of a kind. In addition, in their merit, what were you provided with? So God says, when you were in the desert, did I treat you like you were in the desert? And I even provided furniture for you. Quotes a verse that as you eat in your home, you recline, you're able to recline, to eat it in such a manner. It wasn't secondary accommodation. It was first. So God says, so why are you always complaining? Did I treat you like you were in the desert? In the Ritz-Carlton. We're in the Waldorf. After it was renovated. What are you complaining about? You got room service. Just open your door, you bring in the manna every morning. You don't even have to order it. They know exactly what you want. Any taste you want. Not only that, you don't even need doctors because the food absorbs in your inner organs. and you protect it from all the elements. So Hashem says, did I treat you like you're in a desert? So why are you complaining? Always complaining. What's the answer? You have two people married. The husband's one of a kind of a husband. And the woman doesn't appreciate him. Always complaining. Whenever he gives her, there's always a but. There's always something. He falls short of whatever it is. He cooks, does the dishes, brings in the livelihood, everything. Talks to her with the greatest respect. So what's the problem? I don't love the man. You got it? You can have everything in the world, but if the fit is not right, he's not meant for me. That's why she's complaining. She's not necessarily a bad person, but she says the whole thing was mistaken. It was a mistaken match. If the Jews are complaining in the desert, where God provides every amenity, which is unheard of, if the Jews themselves said, we have a problem, what's the problem? The problem's not with God. The problem's with us. We have no interest in that relationship. And that's what God is proving. You could tell me the man that doesn't taste like onions and like garlic. And it does taste like this or that. You understand something? That's not the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is that if you'd have that dedication to God, and God provides it all, it's not that he's providing it all. There's no reason not to. You have the best of both worlds. So why are you complaining? That is a confirmation you're not interested. Not interested in the relationship. Once explain something with an allegory. This person is a fundraiser for whatever institution. And he goes to a very wealthy man, and the man was agreeable to give him an appointment to hear about what the institution's about, because he was a professional stock, he was a philanthropist. And this person makes a presentation like nobody's ever made such a presentation. I said this recently. And the person thought after that kind of presentation, minimally $10,000 check. After he finished the presentation, he writes him a check for $5. This very wealthy man. Person is like devastated. So before he leaves, he says, Mr. So-and-so, could you tell me where I went wrong? That you only wrote me a $5 check? He says, before you answer, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever heard such a presentation? Has anybody ever been so articulate and so impressive? He says, no. So he says, if that's the case, why did you write me $5? He says, you know why? Because I'm not interested in the cause. That's it. You could have had the best presentation, best accommodations. I have no interest. I go wine dine you because I want you to buy a certain product. Not interested in the product. You can wine and dine me forever. I'm not interested in the product. God says, I've wined and dined you. There's nothing to complain. God just wants to bring to a level of understanding that the problem lies not with God, that God fell short of what he said he would do, but you people have no interest in relationship with God. And when you're confronted with that reality, you really have to rethink what your decision is going to be. If you're out for good. And if you're in, then you better toe the line the way you should toe the line. Because God is not failing on his side, we fail on our side.